Hello and welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Memories. I'm Fash, the $1 million fan, and I'm joined as ever by Wax, the Brain Hussein. Wax, how you doing?
I'm doing really well, Fash. I'm looking forward to WrestleMania in about 7 weeks' time. We've got our tickets all booked up, and we'll see all the fans there in Vegas live in person.
Yeah, can't wait. Hopefully do some live podcasting. Well, let's get on that plane first and get there. But yeah, can't wait. But today's not about wrestling with the present, Wax. Today's all about going back in time to 1993, a very pivotal year again for WWE, not in terms of business, but lots of changes. We've already covered 1992, and today we've got a topic which is close to your heart.
Of course, it's Ric Flair, who is the man still to this day. I think I hold him in very high regard, probably one of my top five wrestlers, if
Would you
not
say
top three.
your morals align with Ric Flair and you know how he acts?
Oh, well, I think in Vegas they certainly will, Fash, but I don't know about anywhere else in the world.
We're gonna get some wax drip in
Oh,
Vegas.
we might do. But obviously, just going back to our timeline through 92, 93, Ric Flair obviously joined the WWF in what was an amazing move back in the day. Nobody really expected it. Obviously, we didn't really read the dirt sheets back then, Fash. When we seen it, it was really difficult to imagine this guy coming and joining WWF with his WCW Championship in hand. Anyway, that run we're going to talk through a little bit in more detail, review whether that was a success or not. But just before we do that, let's just touch upon his final couple of weeks in the WWF and his final match, or his supposedly final match on WWF Raw.
Yeah, Wax, I would just encourage first people to go back and check out our earlier Ric Flair episode. So we cover his entry into WWF, the story behind that, his great history in the NWA, why he was regarded as the greatest wrestler around. You know, we've gone through that part. We've covered the events leading up to his final match with Mr. Perfect on this Monday Night Raw. But, you know, for me, looking at these final moments, we'll talk more about his run in general. It ended on what would be the first classic match in the Monday Night Raw era. This is the third episode of Monday Night Raw. We wouldn't have, you know, I guess the understanding of how big Monday Night Raw would be at this point. Superstars was still big, Wrestling Challenge was still big, but Raw was this live show. It was in the Manhattan Center. It was different. But this was the first marquee matchup. And leading into this, Ric Flair had challenged Mr. Perfect in basically a loser leaves WWF match, which we hadn't seen really up to this point either. Certainly, you and I hadn't seen that sort of concept. But the interesting thing is, I mean, in terms of the lead up to this match, the week prior on Monday Night Raw, Mr. Perfect has a match with Terry Taylor, your old favorite, the Red Rooster. Not the Red Rooster here, but you know, forever known as that. And Ric Flair interferes. Similarly, Ric Flair has a match with El Matador, your other favorite, and Mr. Perfect interferes, which then leads to this challenge. The fact being that Ric Flair doesn't believe the WWF is big enough for both of these guys, right? And that's it. We go to the next week of Raw, you have this match. But the interesting thing is, the match was actually taped straight after that episode. So even though it aired on the 25th of January, it was the week before. Now, that'd be very weird for the audience sitting there, right? Because they've seen this challenge and then the match happens. What's even odder is the match took place before the Royal Rumble, which we've covered in the archives as well. Because of this, so Ric Flair and Mr. Perfect enter the Royal Rumble. That result's already taken place, but they're hyping up on commentary the match the next night in terms of who's going to leave the WWF. And Ric Flair gets eliminated by Mr. Perfect in the match. So it's very convoluted in terms of if you were seeing behind the scenes, it would blow your mind what's going on here. You know, as a viewer watching on TV, it's fine because it works. But if you're in the know, if you're in the Manhattan Center that night, if you're a dirt sheet reader, if you're a smart mark at that point, you know, it was more intriguing maybe behind the scenes what was going on. But the match itself, what did you think of it? Certainly
Uh,
the first classic of the Raw era and one of Ric Flair's best matches over the run.
well, I think definitely a top match. We've got two brilliant competitors in there, Ric Flair and Mr. Perfect, two great wrestlers. They were never going to have a bad match. I think, if this was maybe on a super event like a Mania or a SummerSlam, they would have gone, 30 minutes easily and had a great, absolute, 5-star match, as Meltzer would have no doubt given it. But I thought it was a great match for an early Raw edition. And had you not known the backstory in terms of what was happening behind the scenes, a surprising winner in Mr. Perfect.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of Mr. Perfect, and we'll talk about him in more detail in future episodes. If you look at his run when he returned here and he returned at Survivor Series and we've covered that, he doesn't really have lots of matches in this 1983 run, and you could argue he never hits the heights of his run prior to this. But this is one of the matches which you can talk to. The Bret Hart match at King of the Ring is the best one, and then you've got a whole bunch of matches which are good to average. But certainly he brought his A game here, and Ric Flair did as well. And at the end of it, when the outcome happened, and I think as young fans were still a bit confused. Wait a minute,
Yeah,
is Ric
exactly.
Flair actually leaving? And I guess we spoiled the ending, but we won't go into the blow by blow. But it ends, back and forth. And then Ric Flair's going for an atomic drop, it looks like, but Mr. Perfect grabs him. Perfect flex, 1, 2, 3. And Bobby Heenan, as always, the man that steals the show, goes crazy outside and he's swearing and they're beeping all that out. It's live. And, Ric Flair is no longer in the WWF. And you don't
Absolutely.
recall this, I don't think, Wax, but you were a big Ric Flair fan back as a 6, 7 year old. I remember you deny it now, but you were. So I think at the time you were gutted when it all, you understood it after a week or two that he actually was gone.
I was definitely a big Ric Flair fan, and I was definitely supporting him in this final matchup. And actually, I think it's a good point. We should talk about Mr. Perfect and why maybe this didn't go on to be, bigger and better things later on in 1993. But Ric Flair, obviously a legend of the business, joining WWF back in the 1991, and we thought, what the hell's going on here in the wrestling world? If you had to sum up his run, Fash, how would you class it? And I think I know your answer already, and I know it's based on one key factor. But if you had to give us a review of his run from start to end, would you consider it successful, not successful, or just somewhere in the middle?
But first of all, Wax, you're talking shit as usual by saying you thought this and you thought that back then. I'll be honest, and I think we covered this. You and I didn't really know who Ric Flair was when he debuted
I
in
refuse
WWF,
to
right?
acknowledge that, Fash.
At that point, we didn't know. We got
You forget,
WWF,
Fash. I used to
right?
watch all these dodgy wrestling channels on
I
cable.
think you just watched dodgy channels, but I think all I knew of Ric Flair, and I'll be honest, at that point was I'd seen one of his WCW figures alongside Sting and Lex Luger, so I'd heard the name, I knew the name, and then obviously came in as a big deal, but we hadn't seen WCW at that point. I think it's fair to say, but straight away he was presented as a big deal. In terms of the run, I think because I was more of that young WWF fan at the time, I was confused by it. So,
Hmm.
this guy comes with this title belt. He's the real world champion. Where is he from? Where's he
Yeah.
been wrestling? That's not really explained to the normal audience. That's not the smart audience. And then it's the era of super giants, right? So Sid has just debuted and he's this big beast. Ric Flair being face to face with Hulk Hogan at the time, you just didn't get why this was so big. You got the fact that he's got a belt and he's got a belt, so something is important here. But I think at that point it's confusing for those that didn't know as much. Now, I think in terms of the moments, for me, it was more of a middle one. When Bobby Heenan has the belt at the end of Wrestling Challenge, and you've got Gorilla Monsoon and Jim the Animal Neidhart there, and he says the real world champion's coming. That's a huge moment, right? And they build that up and they take it into SummerSlam 91. Ric Flair's actual debut, I thought was pretty disappointing. It's on those old primetime shows. It's
Hmm.
in front of an audience. Feels a bit weird why you wouldn't have him come out either on a pay-per-view, which would have been that SummerSlam, or on Superstars at that point would be the big show. That didn't happen. It was like the kind of audience thinks that it's a bit lame when you look back at it, but he's there and straight away he's presented as a big deal. And then I think it's kind of up and down from there. He calls out Hulk Hogan, he calls out Roddy Piper first, back and forth there. But then, he is involved. at Survivor Series in an elimination match, where it's about the Undertaker and Hulk Hogan. He interferes. We all think it's leading to WrestleMania, and certainly the people who were smart fans at the time think we're going to get it. WrestleMania it's going to be Flair Hogan, and that doesn't happen. For me, this run is about that debut. It's about the Royal Rumble, which I think when people talk about this run, they largely talk about the Royal Rumble, and that for many is the greatest Royal Rumble ever. It's the greatest performance in the Royal Rumble ever, and to this day it holds up. That's the big moment, and he wins the title. Great post-match interview, and then we don't get Hogan versus him because we've discussed why, and please check out the archives. House show attendance, other factors, what going away. And I think what saves it then is the Savage Elizabeth Ric Flair scenario, which once again we've covered. But post that WrestleMania, then when Matchman wins, I think it starts to peter out, to be honest, in terms of the run. And because of the way he's positioned, he doesn't have a match at SummerSlam. He then wins the title. He then loses the title to Bret Hart, of all people. And then Vince McMahon seemed to have issues with him in the background. So I don't want to elaborate too much on those bits. I would like to talk about them, but to get your view. So for me, people talk about that first one, but they largely talk about the Rumble. And I think we talk about the Matchman feud after that. And then the third thing we talk about is the disappointment not getting Hogan Flair. And to me, the ending of this could have been better. And I'll speak a bit about that as well. How this kind of you see on our Monday Night Raw is gone. When WrestleMania 9 wasn't that far away, could they not have done something there and just ended it there? So for me, it was a bit mixed. I think Vince, you know, didn't feel it after a little while, and there's plenty of evidence of that in the way he was speaking of it
Yep.
near the end. But what's your view? I think you think it's far stronger than that, right?
I think it
And
was
I've got basically one of the Ric Flair fans texting me straight away saying, "What the hell are you talking about?" So
I
I'll
think it
ignore
was
that.
a very successful run, Fash. I think he was immediately a big deal. You know, as soon as you enter the arena wearing that type of
Agree
robe,
with that.
right, with Bobby Heenan behind you, wearing a championship
Mr.
belt,
Perfect later on and Mr.
yeah,
Perfect
Mr.
later on.
Perfect later on, the Dream Team, absolutely tremendous, just appearance and wise. You know, he was looking like a champion, looking like he belonged in the main event. He was paired up with Roddy Piper pretty early on, again giving the rub with a iconic WWF um, star, and then
And they had history with
involved.
each other, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of history back in the day. Then obviously involved in that angle between the Undertaker and Hulk Hogan. Again, an iconic moment where he comes in with the chair and puts it underneath the tombstone. A brilliant moment.
He puts it underneath the
Well,
tombstone.
the tombstone is where the ends up on the
Hogan and
chair.
Undertaker have big issues about this
Well,
wax, which right, he never put his head anywhere near the chair, but that's a topic for another day.
for another day, and yeah, I mean, we should maybe stop believing everything Hogan has to say.
I don't
Uh,
think anyone believes Hogan, but anyway, carry on.
but going back, I think then that iconic run with Macho Man, which
The
has
Royal
obviously,
Rumble and then
yeah,
the yeah, go on.
yeah, and the Royal Rumble. I mean, I'm not going to mention the Royal Rumble again because we've heard it so many times. The greatest
Yeah.
performance ever, absolutely tremendous performance from him, winning the championship at the Royal Rumble. The promo, just everything about it, I think is iconic. One of the most iconic moments of all time. But I think that storyline with Elizabeth Macho Man was one of the greatest of all time. Again, I'll put that into one of my most favorite memories of wrestling throughout watching it for the last 30, 35 years. And then I agree with you, there was probably a bit of a petering out after that, but I think we have to remember that had maybe Ultimate Warrior been part of the plans, which he was part of the plans, and had he stayed on through 92, we could have had quite a culmination between Macho Man, Ultimate Warrior, the Ultimate Maniacs against Ric Flair, Razor Ramon, and Mr. Perfect. And even I think then the turn between Mr. Perfect and Ric Flair was really well done on that episode of
Yeah, we've talked about that, right? And we detail it meticulously.
um, so I think there were so many iconic moments throughout that run that has to be a success. Now, I grant you that the fact that they never had the big payoff between Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan does hurt, right? It's all wrestling fans would have loved to see that back in the heyday, and it's a shame they never got to put that on. I think had he stayed, it we could have got there. And yeah, it might not have had the same meaning as it would have had in '92, but we could have got something really special. And then I think you're right. Ultimately, what happened here was that Vince decided he wanted to go for a younger wrestler, a younger superstar going into the new generation era, and Ric Flair didn't fit the bill. And to be fair, he doesn't, right? He doesn't have that classic look of a Bret Hart or a Shawn Michaels. He's very much more old school in his appearance. But I think it's all right to be a bit different in that sort of era. I think he would have still worked and still been paid off as a really good star. But ultimately, Vince lost, what he thought was going to be Ric Flair in his heyday, and let him move on to back to WCW.
Yeah, for me, there's a few things there, right? This was obviously the phase of Vince McMahon trying to, go younger until Hulk Hogan comes back 2 weeks later, but we'll get to that. The whole Ric Flair thing is really interesting how it happened because, in terms of those that don't know, he supposedly had this kind of handshake agreement with Vince McMahon that if he wouldn't be in the main event or seen as a main event player, then he could leave and go back to WCW. And obviously, in the beginning, Rick wasn't interested in that, right? But then when there was a management change at WCW, Jim Herd is gone, Bill Watts is in there. He kind of warms to the thought of going back. He then hears from Vince that he wants to go younger.
Hmm?
He drops the title to Brett, and then I think he was then supposed to put people over, such as maybe Razor Ramon in terms of a babyface turn. Obviously, Kurt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, and Rick didn't want to be a mid carder or just kind of lose his aura. So then he went to WCW, which if you think about it, people say a lot of things in terms of people leave on bad terms and what have you. This was done
Very
with
amicably,
great
yeah.
agreement. So it seems, but that's my point. Vince didn't care that he was going to lose, and Rick was happy to go back to WCW as well.
There, I think
You've you've lost your audio there, Wax.
he
You know that.
respected the word that he'd given Ric Flair and let him go if Flair wasn't happy. I think
I was hoping you'd set me up there because let's look at the ending of this, right? So Rick talks about, you talk about the Warrior who, as a kid, was one of my favorites. If you watch this podcast from the start, you know that how much of a Warrior mark I was. But Rick talks about the house show matches he had with Ultimate Warrior, and in one of those matches, Warrior hits him for six, and Ric Flair essentially loses his balance, right? And he's got an ear issue, and that's affecting his performances. And they realize how grave that is afterwards. But during this period, then with Rick not being himself, losing his balance, he then drops the title to Rex, which no one saw coming back in 1982, right? I don't care if you're a smart fan or you're us, just nobody saw that. And then from there, it's nearly curtains in that discussion. But even before that, Wax, when Ric Flair won the title for the second time, Vince didn't really treat him the best way he could because he has that match with the Macho Man, but they redo the match, if you
was a
recall,
shit match,
because
Bash. It was a shit match. What can we do?
we've not seen the one. We've not
Vince
seen the
says it was a
original
shit
match.
match, so it must be a shit match.
So he was not happy with interference. Wasn't happy with what's going on. So imagine that this is Ric Flair. This is the match man. But Vince McMahon walks in and says, "No, we're doing it again." And once again, if you're the audience there that night, right, you're like, "What is going on here?" But then ultimately, right, so he makes him redo the match. He wins the title and then he loses it a couple of weeks later to Brett. And then we get the whole, thing about Survivor Series, Warriors gone. No, perfect turn happens quicker than anticipated. Great segment. I agree with you. You love that. You watch it now, it's just great how they did that and how they fixed that Warrior situation so well in the space of a couple of days. And after that, it's the Mr. Perfect thing, and he's gone because of this agreement that he has with Vince. For me, you just said the Hulk Hogan thing, right? What also frustrates me about this is I know Rick wanted to go. I know Vince was fine with him going. But literally, Hulk Hogan returns a couple of weeks later. The next Raw, Brutus Beefcake's back, and he's talking about the Hogan come back in effect without saying it. And, they start the storyline where Hulk Hogan comes back and it's him and Brutus against Money Incorporated. Can you imagine, right, if the whole Ric Flair thing would have been Ric Flair has the match with Brutus, Ric Flair and Razor Ramon beat up Brutus, Ric Flair's the one that damages his face or gives the impression. And then Hulk Hogan comes back. That sets up WrestleMania 9, Hogan versus Flair, and there's an extra layer to it now. And that could have been a retirement match for, whoever loses leaves. And WWE gets their Hogan victory over Flair, and Flair goes back to WCW.
Yeah.
It
Uh,
wasn't to be because it feels like Flair did want to go, and the way this worked out is even though this is his last televised match, his actual final match in WWF WWE at that point is the 10th of February, Wax, where he's in Dortmund, Germany, and he loses to Bret Hart. So it's a European tour, and then a couple of weeks later he's at Super Bowl III,
yeah.
and he makes his triumphant return to WCW. But I'm just saying, if there was, the fact that this was an agreement and they kind of, it came to an end, you could have done something else. Either, as you say, have that match with Kurt Hennig at WrestleMania 9 and give Lex Luger more of a rub in the whole situation because he's just debuted and he's with Heenan as well. Or you have that match with Hogan. If we don't get it, it happens in 1994 in WCW. We'll get to that. But for me, it's some missed opportunities here. But I just felt like, yeah, Vince wanted to move on and Rick wanted to go back home as well. And it wasn't to be. But it promised a lot more, I feel,
Hmm.
when he came into the WWE.
Well, I think when you say promised a lot more, he promised the Hulk Hogan match. That was it. There was nothing else, I think, in that run that was lacking. For me, he did, things with Ultimate Warrior. He did things with Macho Man, Bret Hart, Mr. Perfect. Who else was there that was missing in that run other than Hulk Hogan? And I get it's a big name. It's the biggest one out
But
there.
I think what happened was very quickly, even with all this stuff happening, he wasn't that big deal. Ric Flair, even to change the music, right? He's not even referred to as the Nature Boy.
Hmm.
His run, and then he becomes, like I say, he comes into this world champion. They then can't use the big gold belt. He's got that tag team belt. They digitize it. He then wins the real title for WWF. After that, my point is, it doesn't really go to even with it's great the feud with Macho Man, Elizabeth, everything else, but I don't think he hits the heights that he could have. And I get what you're saying. He takes on the main guys, right? But it was very much he didn't last then as the champion. He won it twice. The second title run, nobody really talks about. And then it comes in. So I just feel I don't think when Ric Flair joined in, the autumn of or the fall of 1991, that he thought he'd be gone
Yep.
by early 93. And I don't think Vince would have thought that. So, yes, he was front and center for the majority of the time, but I just feel it was more about the big moments there, and then the ending could have been better. Some bits post WrestleMania could have been better. But yeah, combination of circumstances, lots of changes in the company, his own health near the end. Let's say I thought it featured out, and then we wouldn't see him for a number of years. But I can see your side of it, but I just feel there was much more
Yep.
that could have happened. Certainly that ending, it was a great match on Raw. Please go and check it out. But I just felt weird that it ended before going into WrestleMania, and that was on, even doing both sides for that.
Yep. I mean, in reality, the run petered out, and Ric Flair leaves WWF, and we move into the new generation era, the Monday Night Raw era. And I think, we've got a lot to discuss throughout the course of 1993, moving into just, huge changes for the company, seeing Brett, seeing Yokozuna at Mania, seeing the return of Hulk Hogan,
Well,
thinking
that's
we're
it.
going
If there's
backwards rather than
yeah,
forwards. And
if
then,
there's one man that didn't want the new generation to come, it's Hulk Hogan. So we obviously talked about Flair leaving. The next topic is Hogan coming in, right? Because if there was one man that was going to stop the plans from going forward, and was going to annoy Brett then and even now, it was the Hulkster. But as you say, you keep talking 92, 93, a lot of changes. And yeah, this was weird. Even when you go back and watch it, it's weird and it gets a bit weirder.
yeah. I mean, I think we've just left the golden era of WWF, haven't we? And we've entered a new era where we're going to struggle to really get that same level of prime time viewership from fans across the world. So that's what we're going to cover in the next few episodes, hopefully, Fash. Until then, he's Fash, I'm
Until
Wax, and this
I think
has been
no, no,
Wrestling with Memories.
I
Fash,
think you need to
see
do a
you
move.
later.
I think you need to do a move, Max. You need to do a move.
Woo!
There
No, I
you
think I've just
go.
woken up the baby, Fash. I better go.
Take it easy.